Good morning, everyone. It is so lovely to see you. It's a very crowded room this morning. Welcome to the second webinar of the Digital Justice Grants Program Fall Webinar Series titled Digital Justice in Practice, Tools, Methods, and Deliverables. If you missed the first webinar, which occurred last week, that was a general information session about the program, its ethos, design, and some of the application components. We are hoping to have that recording up on the ACLS website next week, as well as the transcript. And there you can also find the recording of the first half of this session. So my name is Kiana Nurse, Senior Program Officer of IDEA Programs, which stands for Intentional Design for an Equitable Academy. I'm also the program lead of the Digital Justice Grants Program. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Javon Bickerstaff, who's the director of IDEA, who will be moderating one of the breakout sessions and keeping an eye on the tech behind the scenes. So before I introduce our very esteemed interlocutors, I want to say a few words about the intention behind this webinar series. We started it last year really as an effort to provide a forum for applicants to directly engage with former reviewers of our digital grants program. So that includes Digital Justice, our Sunsetting Digital Extension program, and then also our Digital Commission. Not everyone, has access to the informal information sharing networks that can really determine whether or not a proposal gets funded. And so these webinars sought to unveil some of the hidden curriculum of grant writing and to also provide some insight into specific aspects of this program. But just as other parts of this program have evolved and been refined, so too have these webinars. This year's webinar series has been curated based on feedback from reviewers about areas where they wanted to see applicants get more coaching, but also from applicants who expressed a desire for more advisement on specific components of their application. So just like you all today, they attended last year's sessions and completed our post-webinar survey. So I'm grateful that we've been able to actually actualize some of that feedback and translate that into this session that delves more deeply into some of the concrete aspects of digital projects that our reviewers for this program evaluate. And I also say that, to encourage you to complete the survey that will pass on to you at the end of the session. It really does make a difference in terms of the kinds of programming that we offer. So now to get started, I'd like to introduce our first interlocutor, Tatiana Bryant, who is the Director of Teaching, Learning, and Research Services at Barnard College. There, she leads the personal librarian team, which provides specialized research and instruction services for all Barnard students and serves as subject liaisons to all academic departments. Before joining Barnard, she was the research librarian for digital humanities, history, and African American studies at the University of California, Irvine. She earned an MPA from NYU and an MSLIS from Pratt Institute and a BA in history from Hampton University. Our next interlocutor is Rachel Kuo, who is currently an assistant professor of gender and women's studies and Asian American studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research interest on social movements and digital technology has received support from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Social Science Research Council. And she is a founding member and current affiliate of the Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies, and also a co-founder of the Asian American Feminist Collective. So I'm very, very happy that they have agreed to join us today to engage in some discussion about, again, some of these concrete aspects of the digital projects that ultimately get funded through this program. So before we jump into that discussion, I just want to give you a quick overview so you know what to expect. We'll start this session with about 30 minutes of discussion related to the topic. And again, just to reiterate, that discussion has specifically been curated around two of the application prompts. So the first, what digital tools and methods are at the center of the project. Please detail how those tools and methods inform both the project's intellectual contributions and its advancement of equity and justice. And then the second, please detail the project's digital deliverables as well as its outcomes and anticipated intellectual contributions. We really wanted to create a conversation that would prompt people to start thinking about how they might respond to those prompts and whether or not you're applying this year or thinking about applying next year. After we have that discussion, we'll then go into the breakout rooms where there'll be an interlocutor and an ACLS staff member in each one. This will give you an opportunity again to get some concrete feedback on how you're approaching those specific prompts. And then finally, we'll reconvene in the larger room for some closing remarks. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that way we can engage in this discussion. So the first question that I want to ask to get us started to our interlocutors is really about what is the best tool or tools or methods to use when you're sort of framing your project or thinking about your projects. And so either in your own projects or as you've evaluated other digital projects, what are some initial considerations that you can offer in order to determine the best or most appropriate tool or method to use for a specific line of inquiry at the center of the project? And I wanted to start here because I think we're all well equipped to sort of talk about the intellectual contributions of a project and also very well equipped to sort of do that work of problem setting. But as my colleague Javon has said, sometimes you need a hammer as a specific tool, but then you pick up a wrench. And so how do you know the difference between, this is a really great tool for this specific problem because of the specific inquiry versus another kind of tool? And so Rachel or Tatiana, feel free to jump in when you're ready.
I guess I can start and maybe we can just kind of have like a back and forth conversation about it because I think this is such a great question to begin. And I think that what you pose, right, like so often we read applications that like beautifully detail a literature, a problem. And then in the last paragraph, it reads like, oh, like, and then we'll create a website or then we'll, right, like create this thing. And like all the questions that pop up are like, wait, like how do we get from like A to B? And I think often I've been like ruminating on this question a lot since you sent it. And I think one of the things that I think a lot about is the kind of ways that the method and process informs that output, right? So this question of like best tool or method to use, I think about that in a really plural way because there's a lot of considerations to move through the process from point A to B. And so, for example, if one of the outputs might be like, oh, we're going to put up like a digital archive or we're going to use this platform, right, like to display these materials, then what are the other methods, right? Like that might like help us understand like how this is going to be cataloged, organized. Like, are there going to be, for example, like different interviews, right? Like with people along the way of how they're engaging with artifacts. And so I think sometimes the question also of best tool and method, especially for grants that are focused on the digital, is that the tool and method doesn't always also have to be digital, right? That there's like a lot of different kinds of methodologies that can be used along the way to inform an output. And also the output at the end also doesn't have to be digital per se, right? But it could purport to answer a problem that digital technologies have shaped. And so I think those are some of the things that immediately come to mind. But I do want to pass it over to Tatiana, and then maybe we can kind of swap conversations or stories about this.
I like to, I think I like to encourage people to start small, and to think about the expertise you have around you and your own expertise. Think about what you're drawn to. And if you're, working on a project on your own, or if you have a small group, if you're at a smaller institution that may not have as much infrastructure as some larger institutions, all of these things kind of come to bear. I always encourage people to reach out and to ask questions on your own campus if you see faculty members or others doing really interesting things, working on interesting projects. Ask them questions like, did you hire a developer? Are you self-taught? What are some of the things that you've explored to get to that point? You also have to, I think, be a bit realistic about your own capacity. Are you interested in learning a new tool? Are you interested in learning something from the ground up? Do you have resources around you, people who have a particular skill set who can help you draft something and pilot it and test it out? I would say that I really like to think of this kind of like as if you're starting from the beginning of a project, think about maybe a petting zoo, pulling together a number of different tools and methods and trying a little bit. There's some really wonderful tutorials online. There's some great journals. I'm thinking about Reviews in DH, where you could look at different projects and look at in pretty succinct ways, like what the back end looks like, what kind of work went into developing this. And yeah, that's where I like to encourage people to begin. Think about your own capacity, whether or not you're interested in learning to create something from the ground up. Look around you, look at the resources around you who can demo something for you, what you can slowly kind of pilot and play with, and think about it as kind of a petting zoo. I'd like to encourage people to try as many things as possible, while also like being kind of realistic about your capacity and your time when you're thinking about starting digital projects.
I really like that metaphor of thinking about it as a petting zoo, and also thinking about, right, your capacity, what kind of expertise you have around you. And I think particularly with so many of these projects, folks are working with, community partners. And so also having to take that consideration into the kinds of tools or methods that you use for your project. And so, we have talked a lot about data ethics in this program, but we've talked about it insofar as data collection, maintenance, and ownership. But I also think, again, you can apply that question to, thinking about the specific tools and methods that you use, because you are going to be engaging with community members and using their expertise in particular ways. And so I'm wondering if either of you or both of you can talk about, a project that marries some clear ethical considerations with the specific tools used, or how those tools were used. So not even just the tool itself, but also like the method around it.
Do you want to go first, or should I?
Do you want to for this one, or?
Well, I think that I can go ahead and go first. I would say a number of projects come to mind. I think like a real gold standard is the Colored Conventions project that's run on Drupal, which is open source. I think that really ties into the ethos of the project as well. A lot of what's been developed over time has been really integrated with community. And they've had this ethos where they bring people in and take them along for the ride of growing this over time. I don't know if it's super helpful to add links while I'm talking into the chat. I can do that as well. I also really admire projects that use the Mukutu platform. And I don't know, Rachel, if you wanted to speak to that more.
Yeah, I was thinking about like maybe like on a different vein on, I guess, like the kind of ethical considerations as well. Like actually like thinking about ethics, and I think about this a lot in terms of the kind of community work and the kinds of things along the way of like what is it that we do actually need to do and what we don't. actually need to collect. And so I think like also in terms of ethics, like there's two documents that right, like there's like the Feminist Data Manifesto, and then also some friends at like the Carceral Tech Resistance Network, but they actually have this really thoughtful way of talking through digital tools. And so for example, one of the things that the organizers has talked about before was like even this kind of like the design and the interface of a spreadsheet, right? And so makes you want to fill out data about like, right, like it's like, okay, like now we have to like get the names, we have to get the email addresses, we have to get like all of these things. And so like something that I think about like a lot of times in these projects is like, what is it that we actually have to collect? Like what is it that we can like let go of? Think very clearly and with intention and thoughtfulness about like what is it that yeah, like what is it that we're actually putting in like as like an output? What is it that we can actually refuse to do? um I think there's like often questions. It's like, does this tool like need to be made? Like, who is it for? Who does it serve? Actually, a project that I have really loved has been Sarah Nguyen. She has done this like very cool project around like sending news back home about mis and disinformation in Vietnamese communities. And so they created a digital zine, right? Like that's bilingual in English and Vietnamese. But then to actually get people to read it, because actually people in community are not going to find this like digital artifact that lives right like online, even if it's open access and open source. And so actually it's like taking the time to do different like local and community workshops with right like with food, with community elders to actually engage with this resource and have conversations about it. And so I think it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about like process and tool, right? It's like, so just like as this thing gets created, like who is it for? How are we actually distributing it? How are people going to engage with it? Because I think there are like so many amazing digital tools, digital softwares, digital platforms, but they actually aren't, even if it's open and available, like not always, right? Like the easiest for folks, right? Like that we're often seeking to engage with these. I think people often talk about like, oh, like we want to work with like community or we want to work with folks who are most directly impacted. But sometimes, right, like then does like this digital object that lives like online, like is it actually reaching the folks that people are hoping to connect with?
Yeah, I think that's a great reminder to constantly trouble the build it and they will come sort of mindset that can accompany the creation of digital projects. That, you know, the dissemination plan and the engagement plan actually has to be intentional and also, you know, not a sort of discrete phase that happens after you've already built the thing, but can actually is a set of concerns that can be engaged with as you're, you know, choosing the very tools that you're building the thing with. And so, Rachel, as you were speaking, you know, it reminded me of this sort of, you know, perhaps tension that can sometimes emerge between data security and accessibility, especially if you are engaging with community partners and you want a wide variety of folks, a large audience to access the materials of the project. And so when you're choosing specific tools or platforms, you know, how do you navigate not only that tension, but also thinking about, you know, the ways that your community partners are going to engage with the tech that you're developing, or your audience also are going to engage with the tech that you're developing.
I love this question too. And this, when I was thinking about this answer, kind of comes out of a project that I did that was with workers in informal economies. And like the kind of question was like, well, what is, you know, this relationship between digital technology used for organizing and the kinds of, right, like the ways that people navigate precarity and risk. And one of the things that really came out to it that I think is that helpfully, I think, informs this question, I think, about security and access. And it's hard because I think in applications you don't want to overly get into the weeds, but you do want to demonstrate, right, like that there's like a kind of thoughtfulness. Gets informed. But for example, one of the things that really came out of the kind of conversations was that there's a lot of presumptions, right, about privacy and security that are really based in this kind of notion, right, of like the individual like device, right, and presuming that everybody has access, right, like to a singular laptop or to like a singular phone, right. And so I think like that was like something that like I've been thinking a lot about too. It's like, well, there are beyond the digital tool itself, like what are the kinds of other practices of like safety, security, et cetera, that people are already implementing. Um, I think, for example, like something else that came out of those conversations, right, is that, like, for example, a Zoom conversation like this, like people can dial in, but if they dial in, they can't actually see the slides, right? And so, like, groups like talking about that they actually like take the time to like print out like all of these things and like distribute it to people in hand so they actually have paper materials, right? I think like there's other times like where people have talked about like, okay, like you can't just presume, right? Like there's like a singular email or phone number, et cetera, that like you can reach people, but it also is not good to store that information somewhere. And so how do you actually navigate these frictions, right? And so I think once we start thinking about like the particular, I don't know, like I guess I don't know if edges or peripheries or et cetera, or like these kinds of like ways technology on the margins, how people differently, right, like experience like the same technologies that sometimes we take for granted. It helps actually think about like how do we build out a plan for security and access. I think often another friction point, right, is like when the university tools that are most secure, like I think about Box, et cetera, like OneDrive that universities or institutions often rely on is not the easiest, right? Like to get people to collaborate with you on. So you like you either have to build in time for that kind of like reciprocal technical training, or begin to have like conversations about what does like access actually mean, what does collaboration look like, and kind of thinking through those day-to-day frictions.
I think that was a really great answer, Rachel. I guess I can talk about this, kind of thinking of I'm thinking about it in a few different ways, data security versus access. And so if I'm thinking about security around the materials we collect, things we might want to engage with in digital projects, I think that when you're developing project, particularly when you're working with community members, you're collecting stories, oral history, information, objects, photographs. I really encourage people to think kind of in a long-term way. I'm working on a couple of projects now where we've had to go back and do a reconsent because the agreements we had with individuals are not expansive enough. And so that's something I would kind of keep in mind, considering we really want to, it really depends on what the project is. You may want to make, whether it's photographs or oral histories, fully and freely available online. But all of that you have to really kind of work to come to agreement with that with individuals whose stories or testimonies they are their own, belongs to them. I also kind of want to take a different tact here. I'm thinking about data security and accessibility and how inaccessible some of our universities are. So when it comes to actually getting onto a campus and seeing physical materials, that really is an argument to make everything as widely accessible online as possible. People either can't or they don't feel comfortable coming to a campus to view physical materials. That is an argument to, for all of, many digital projects to make them as widely available as possible. But there's also a tension there with making sure that if you're collecting data from people, whether they're stories or photographs or objects, that you're taking them along with you. And they absolutely understand what they're agreeing to in consent forms and agreements. Because it does take a lot of time and energy to go back and ask for reconsents. And it's also, not fully in your control. We can't know everything at the start of a project, but it's always something to keep in mind.
Thank you for that. I wish we all had crystal balls to sort of give us some insight into particularly what different tools will do and also what platforms will evolve into as you make decisions at different phases of your project. And so, in line with that of trying to be as proactive and forward thinking as possible with respect to, generating MOUs or consent agreements with the folks that you're engaging with in your projects. I want to sort of adopt that perspective to thinking about the different tools or platforms that folks might be considering to use at different phases of their project. And so again, we all don't have crystal balls and we can't imagine, what might happen 5, 10 years from now. But what are maybe 1 or 2 considerations you make in your own work, or if you've advised others to think about when making decisions about where their projects will live or what tools to use within the project, keeping in mind that these things are dynamic and they change in all kinds of ways.
It's interesting that you say crystal ball, because I think so much of, right, like the grant process is speculative, because you're speculating into something that might not come to be, right, if like the resources don't come to fruition. And you're like, if you're working and collaborating, you're asking other people to speculate with you. And then by the time, right, like if you get the grant, like then you're also like, okay, actually, like things have changed since then. And actually, like, how are we like rethinking this? I think the kind of forward thinkingness, I do think on one end it is like a kind of budget question, and like on the very like thin layer, right, is like, so let's say you want to put something up online, like how is that actually, like that domain, that like website, that hosting space, like who is maintaining that, is like how is that being accounted for? Like recently I was just already in like a conversation with people where we're like, oh, the website link is down, like who, like, and by then, right, like people like don't remember the login, like what, and so I think like those are real things, and I'm sure many of us here have, right, like wanted to go back to a resource. This also just recently happened to me where I was like, oh, I really want to look at the data from this very cool project, and it's like no longer, right, like it like kind of, you can get to the link but everything is like glitching, or it says like 404, or like the data is not populating. um the lifespan of these projects, it's like when we think like 1 or 2 years like goes by really quickly, right? Like some of the things that I'm looking for like were projects that emerged like in 2020, 2021, right? Like at this kind of moment when people were trying to track things, and then even, right, like preceding that, and we realize now like these projects are like 5 years old, 6, 7 years old, and they don't function the same way. But so it's like the kind of question of like longevity and digital, it's like I think tricky to think through that. I think beyond the budget, I think like one of the things is like thinking about like how does a project like sunset, right? Like I think oftentimes we spend a lot of time like thinking about beginnings but not ends, right? And that like the end kind of abruptly comes like by either like a kind of like technical ending, right? Like, or sometimes like, because I work a lot more movement spaces because of conflict, but we often don't thoughtfully plan out like what does it mean for something to come to a close, right? I think going back to the question of ethics, like sometimes we don't want projects to live forever online, right? Like there's something like maybe 10, 15 years, we don't want like this information to be found. So what does that mean? Who does take ownership, right, of certain things, whatever ownership might mean? I think I've seen other projects, right? Like, so things might live in a kind of shared drive or a cloud, like, and then things like either disappear or people lose access, but that doesn't mean that that thing is gone. So I think it becomes this like thoughtful, deliberate, as you speculate, to be like, actually, like we do want this thing at least to be 5 years long, to live like online, and then like, like year 4 we might be having a conversation of what does it mean to archive, sunset, etc.
Um, yeah, that's a great point, Rachel. Thinking about the end of the project when you're dreaming about the beginning of the project, I think is something that is just like best practice. I would say going back to thinking about the people at your campus, the resources around you, having conversations with librarians and archivists and digital scholarship specialists, looking at um, and really putting in a preservation plan in place, thinking about how long you know want this project to live, how long you're planning to teach with it. If you have project partners who are investing in this project long term. People change institutions, people change jobs, all of these kind of real and like pragmatic things that come to bear across digital projects, in spite everyone's like best intentions. I would say that yeah, so keeping the end in mind when you're planning the beginning is key. And for your project.
Yeah, I love that sort of idea of intentional sunsetting, right? Because all too often, like Rachel said, the end of a project comes because you've run out of money or someone has moved. And so I think, the ability to intentionally sunset is also about the relational and infrastructural capacity around a project. So who's sort of contributing to it and what kinds of things do they offer in terms of either technical expertise or other kinds of expertise related to the project. And so I did also want to raise up that is something that we ask about, I think, in the development prompts about this question of intentional sunsetting. Like, if that's part of your plans, what does that look like? Because that is also, I think, part of what can constitute a successful project as well.
And I'll add that thinking about sunsetting it's difficult, but it's also something you have to live with during the life of a project, particularly if you're choosing tools that are proprietary, owned by companies that might get sold or their products might change. And we don't have that crystal ball to see if or when that might occur. So it very much ties into the previous questions around data security and kinds of platforms that we're choosing.
So I did want to, in the last sort of 10 minutes that we'll be having discussion before we go into the breakout rooms, make sure that we talk about the digital deliverable component of this session. And also, since it's, featured in one of the prompts. And so just starting as a basic definition of terms, I always love these kinds of questions because they're always more complicated than one realizes. But how would you characterize the difference between tools, methods, platforms, and deliverables, just so that we're clear and also have a bit of a shared vocabulary as we go into the breakout sessions?
This is a great question. And I really appreciate this question about coming together, having a shared vocabulary. I would, when I think about tools, digital tools that people mention, I think about really kind of discrete things, like timeline tools like Night Lab. I think about IIIF, Universal Viewer, which lets you look at images as well as like audio and video on websites. I think about crowdsourcing tools, and some of those are like thinking about some of the big ones like from thepage.com. So I think about tools in very kind of discrete ways. As far as methods, I think about, when I think about a particular method, it's a way of thinking about and manipulating humanities data. So a method could be GIS to create maps or text analysis to analyze a corpus. When I'm thinking about platforms, I'm thinking about a much bigger system, something that houses and holds digital or digitized content, either for preservation or access or both. A platform is something where you can exhibit and view things. You can manipulate and add and remove content. So I'm thinking of things like Mukatu and Omeka and Twine. And when I think about deliverable, which is such like corporate jargon, but I use it as a shorthand to think about pulling everything together. So it looks like, you know, a digital project that's integrated with scholarship and teaching resources. To me, it feels pulled together like a package.
Yeah, I love this question too. And then even as I was taking notes for the definitions, I was like, they like overlap in different ways, but like I do see them as distinct things. I think similarly, I think more broadly, I think about tools, and it's helpful, I guess, also for folks in the room, right? Like that reviewers might also have different definitions, but I think kind of broadly, what is it that people are kind of like broadly looking for? I think it's like kind of like these four words like hit on several different things that I think people read for. But I think of like the tools as like almost like the how you do or execute a method, right? So if the method is text or visual analysis, or you're trying to do storytelling, or you're trying to do like oral history or interviews or a kind of archival like research, then like what are like the tools that you are using to do that thing, or that like the kinds of things at hand that you're employing, is one way that I've thought about it. And then I guess like kind of like thinking about, yes, like platforms, I feel like that's like the tool of distribution, right? Like where is like this thing going to live? um then I do think deliverables, I think both similar, and then where I diverge, I guess, from Tatiana's definition is that like I also think of it as like the small things along the way, because I think sometimes like we do, and maybe going back to that comment of like, you know, starting small, um, is I think oftentimes like we do think of deliverables as that like huge thing, but I think also encouraging, right, like, and I think this kind of gets to the like whether something's in a seed phase or development phase. But for example, if something's in its early phase, like actually I'm not expecting, right? Like that there's going to be like a finished thing at the end. I'm actually like, there's no way. Like like the deliverables might actually be like, we are gonna like get all the stakeholders in a room together like 3 times and like have a conversation, and like the money is like going to be bringing people in to actually like have this conversation or this workshop, right? And then that is like the deliverable or the output, right? Or that like, you know, part of it's like the relationship building, or like what is the kind of like concept that is going to be like refined, or to say like we're actually going to like try out, right, like doing this like interview or this oral history like with 10 different people, but actually it might not be, right, like the actual thing. And so I think deliverables can be at varying scales.
Yeah, I absolutely agree also that the deliverable is the sort of corporate jargon. But I was sort of trying to think about a way to capture just the outcomes of the project, right? Of you know, you propose activities that the grant will fund. Well, what will be the outcomes of that, right? And I think, Rachel, your point of thinking about what happens, the small things that can happen throughout the lifespan of a grant term, getting people together in a room to discuss X, and then the outcome of that conversation building on to the next phase. And I want to sort of just highlight that because, you know, we have recently folded in this arm of capacity building into one of the larger goals of the program, which is really about bolstering the ability for folks, particularly at historically under-resourced institutions or within underfunded fields, to simply engage in this work and to bring more people into it. But in that messaging, I've tried to be very diligent about keeping scale at the center of that, right? And so thinking about the deliverables of a project, in what ways does it sort of further that mission? And so I'm wondering in these last couple of minutes if you could share one or two strategies that applicants can consider as they think about how their deliverables link to this larger priority of capacity building as I've just defined it.
I guess I can start. I think one of the things around, and I think scale is a good one, because I don't think, again, like scale doesn't have to be big. And so, and I think actually what's really nice about, I think the ACLS, like Digital Justice Grant, I think compared to some other kind of digital focused or tech forward grants is that I think often sometimes irresponsibly like overly demand, right? An output like of a sort to be like, okay, like did you create like a brand new innovative like tool or like a new technology or this like shiny object? And I think, right, like actually I think there is something else that can be said. So I feel like some of the strengths, or I think concretely like a strength that I look for as like I personally read is this kind of like thoughtfulness around feasibility and whether that feasibility has been informed by a thorough analysis of power and context, right? So that like I look for both like a kind of there's like an intellectual thrust of the project, but also political stakes, and how does that actually match the like those like things around like tools and method, but then also like platform and deliverable, right? And that like these things all like link up in a kind in a very like thoughtful kind of way. And I think sometimes like with scale it might not be vague, but it might be like we are actually doing like a really deep engagement like around this thing, like not maybe, and that's tricky because sometimes it's like, well, is this too niche? But I think there's like a kind of like depth that I think that we can think of like vis-a-vis scale, that like versus a kind of like, I don't know, wide expansiveness when it comes to scale.
Thanks for that answer, Rachel. I appreciate it. I would say that one thing I look for is feasibility. And I think it's okay to be clear in an application that your project is bigger than what this grant will allow you to develop. So being kind of clear in that narrative that this particular grant will help me do X and Y and maybe not Z. I think that I think it's very helpful for readers to, you know, understand that you kind of see your project on this big on the scale, and that you have expectations that like meet like whatever outcomes can like reasonably be funded by a particular kind of pot of money. And so I appreciate reading the vision and then also seeing that in like the narrative scale down a bit, like this is what we plan to do in this amount of time with this funding if we're awarded it. Hopefully that makes sense.
Does. Thank you both for offering really great starting point as we transition into the breakout session. So again, just as a reminder, that part of the session will not be recorded. So I'm going to stop the recording now. All right. So again, I hope you had a good session in the breakout rooms. Before we concluded, I just wanted to go through some quick reminders, housekeeping issues, just to have in the back of your mind if you're still thinking about applying. I wanted to remind folks about the deadline for applications, which is December 3rd at 9 p.m. After this date and time, our online fellowship application will no longer allow for submissions, and unfortunately, we cannot allow for any extensions of any kind. And I wanted to particularly flag this because this is also the deadline by which the administrators at your respective institutions should submit their institutional verification. And so if you are going to apply, I recommend that you register in the application portal as soon as possible. You don't have to finish the application in one setting. You can go through it, look at it, save it, and also you can submit your administrator's email address so that the portal can send them instructions on how to submit that form. In terms of when we will roll out decisions, given the increased volume of applications we received in last year's competition, there was a 140% increase in applications between the 2021-2022 pilot year and last year. Because of that, we've had to restructure our review process to institute an additional round of review. So the results of that first round will be shared in February, followed by the final results in April. I also wanted to make sure that you were aware of the remainder of the series for this fall's webinar series. So in a few weeks, on October 17th, we have a conversation around cultivating community partnerships. In DH, that topic came up a little bit today in terms of thinking about the specific tools that we pick and how our community partners engage with those tools, but we'll do an even deeper dive around what that looks like. Then after that, we'll have some office hours where it's very informal. If you have any questions about your application or about the online portal, then you can just pop in, ask your question, and then pop out. Following in mid-November, we have another webinar with some interlocutors where we get into operationalizing these projects. So really doing a deep dive into things like budgets and timelines and work plans, which often feel like the neglected parts of applications because folks spend, rightfully so, they spend a lot of time on the sort of intellectual underpinnings of a project. But I think getting into these concrete how-tos and how people approach that is super helpful because, again, we want to make sure that that aspiration towards justice and digital justice is reflected in every component of the application. And then we'll have another round of office hours in late November, right before the deadline, so that if you have any lingering questions or concerns, you can, again, pop in and ask away. So I want to thank you all for attending. This has been a really great conversation. I want to thank our interlocutors, Tatiana Bryant and Rachel Kuo, for attending as well and giving just time, wisdom, insight, grace. It's been phenomenal to get to know all of you all and to chat. And so, and best of luck on your application and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.